Spiritually, we understand that this life is just one chapter of a longer story. So a story never begins at birth. Every single question which Arjun asks is a question that you will ask at some point in your life. It was difficult. I was going against the grain of society. How do you step against all of that? How can I live my life in such a way that I'll not have regrets?
That's an absolutely incredible journey. Namaste and welcome to A Seeker's Journey. A Seeker's Journey is intended to be a conversation with spiritualists, talking to them about their journey, their challenges, how they've used the words of the scriptures and brought them to life. My name is Om Tumatkar and I'm delighted today to welcome Swayam Bhagwan Keshava Swami Maharaj. Now, Swami Maharaj is one of the senior most members of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness here in the UK. Maharaj, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's an honor to be with you, Om. We've been a fan of your channel and we've been watching your videos, and it's wonderful, the content and the energy and the wisdom you're putting out there in a world which really needs it.
Maharaj, I can absolutely assure you that I'm a bigger fan of yours. But thank you once again for joining us. Now, for those who may not know, you were born here in the UK and studied at the prestigious University College London, after which you decided to dedicate your life to service and the study of scriptures. I'll let you tell your journey in just a second, but I'm just really curious. What does it take for someone born and brought up in London and studied at one of the premier institutes in the world to decide that service and study of the scriptures is the right path for them?
Well, your program is entitled A Seeker's Journey, and I guess that is pretty much what sums up my life. I grew up in Wembley, in the suburbs of London, and of course, spiritually, we understand that this life is just one chapter of a longer story. So a story never begins at birth. A story always begins in the chapters before it, because we come in with a personality into this life. And therefore, from a young age, I always saw certain traits within me, which I guess were a little unusual. As a young child, I always gravitated towards minimalism. I enjoyed solitude. I felt somewhat embarrassed sometimes to have the best trainers or the best clothes and stand out materially. And it was kind of strange, because I was thinking, what does this all mean? And why do I feel like this? So I kind of sat with those feelings. And when I was about 15 or 16, spiritual questions began coming up within me. And that's when I contacted the Bhagavad Gita and started reading the wisdom and interacting with other monks and spiritual people. And then finally, all the elements eventually came together. This kind of attraction towards minimalism on one side, this desire to understand life in a deeper way on another side, and this real aspiration to do something for the world to make it a better place. And becoming a monk kind of combined all three in one. And therefore, at the age of 21, after graduating from university, I decided it was time for a career change.
Wow.
Well, it's not really a career change, because I never really had a career in the first place. I literally graduated and I decided to go to India, and that was the beginning of my monastic journey.
That's an absolutely incredible journey. And I mean, if I share my experience, the first time I read the Bhagavad Gita, I felt holier than anyone else around me, until I got to the point where Bhagwan was actually talking about philosophy. And I realized that there's a lot that I just don't understand. Yeah. So what was your experience like first reading the Bhagavad Gita?
Yeah, it was a profound experience, but not for the reasons you may imagine. I was 15. I got a copy of the Gita. My best friend gave one to me. I went home that day in great anticipation with this kind of feeling within me that now I'm going to open this book and all the mysteries of life will be revealed to me. And I opened the book, I read one page, and I just had to close it because everything just went over my head. It was, the philosophy was complex, the terminology was unfamiliar, and it was very difficult to digest. But it was profound, because even though I didn't intellectually understand it, something within my heart and my intuition told me this is incredibly profound, but I'm not going to be able to understand it myself. I need help. And it was the first time in my life that I had read a book that I didn't understand, but which touched me on a deeper level beyond the intellect. And therefore I pursued my study, and over the years I've hopefully dived a little deeper into it.
Well, you certainly have, and you've helped thousands, tens of thousands of people understand the Gita as well. And I think you touched on a really important point, because scripture as a body of study, but the Bhagavad Gita specifically, is quite intimidating to begin with. So what was it that sort of helped you persevere in your understanding? What helped you sort of go beyond that first page, which was a little bit too difficult to digest?
Yeah. One of the monks told me something very early in my journey which fascinated me. He said, every single question which Arjuna asks is a question that you will ask at some point in your life. Yeah. He looked at me and he said, the Bhagavad Gita will answer your questions before you've even asked them. Oh. And so I was kind of like, okay, wow, if all of these are the questions I'm going to ask, I was really attentive, I was really interested, I was really attracted, like what questions is Arjuna going to ask Krishna? And that was very, that inspired me to kind of look into it in a deeper way. And as I began reading deeper with help from other spiritualists, then I realized it's absolutely true. Nowadays in the world, people ask, like, how can I control my mind? Arjuna asked the same question. Nowadays we think, can I really be spiritual and live in the world amongst all these material complexities at the same time? Arjuna asked the same question. Sometimes we think, what kind of character, what kind of qualities do I have to develop to become the best version of myself and successful? Arjuna asked the same question. So every single question is just so pertinent and so powerful that I just found it fascinating. Yeah.
And there's a side to spirituality that is met with a lot of skepticism. I feel particularly in the youth today, there's this belief that spirituality, particularly study of the Bhagavad Gita, is something that you undertake later in life, whereas it's the diametric opposite for you. You started very, very early. What would your response be if someone comes up to you, or if you speak to someone and say you should study the Bhagavad Gita, and they turn around and say, not for another 50 years? How would you convince them to try?
Yeah. Well, you just have to look at the cover of the Bhagavad Gita, and what you see is a battlefield. And if there's any place where, a battlefield is a very interesting setting, because there's the immediate pressure of what's going on in life now, because, everyone's about to engage in a full-scale war. So the here life is incredibly in focus on a battlefield. But the amazing thing about a battlefield is that the afterlife is also in focus, because on the battlefield, people could die at any moment. So the battlefield is it's an incredibly amazing setting, because it's a setting in which the immediate is super important and the ultimate is also super important. And for me, that's what the Bhagavad Gita is. It's a book which definitely is teaching you about the afterlife, but it's a book which is very much equipping you to live in the here life. And therefore, Yeah, the Bhagavad Gita teaches you all the things you need to navigate this world in the here and now. I often tell people the Bhagavad Gita is the ultimate book in self-development. And if you look at any self-development book on the shelf, and there are many wonderful books out there and authors, you'll find that the roots of everything that they're talking about can actually be found within the Bhagavad Gita.
Wow. There's so many parts of that answer that I'm just absolutely going to steal and use the next time someone asks me. And we can keep talking about the Bhagavad Gita, but I wanted to bring it back to your own specific journey and understand a little bit about what your experiences were when you got out of university and decided to enter the monastery. What was that like? What was the experience of it like?
It was difficult. I was going against the grain of society. Parents, friends, the world around us paints a picture of success, paints a picture of what your life should be, paints a picture of what you should have achieved by the time you're 25, 30. The message is doctor, lawyer, or failure. So it was almost like, how do you step against all of that?
Yeah.
And it was a little bit displacing. I had wonderful relationships with my family, my parents, but I had to start making difficult decisions. It was a question between making people happy and following my heart. And so it was a time of incredible soul searching. And it was a time in which I meditated a lot on not wanting to have any regrets in my life. And if there's one thing I'd say to our viewers, is that we should always keep that as a major thing in focus. That how can I live my life in such a way that I'll not have regrets?
Yeah.
And so I realized that this was sitting deep within me, a desire to spiritually explore, and I had to follow my calling. So I joined the monastery. I was 21. I went to India for 6 months. We lived on the floor, we slept on the floor, lived out of a locker, cold showers in the morning.
Where in India, if you don't mind me asking?
I was staying in Mumbai.
Okay.
And we have an ashram there in Chowpatty,
Yes.
a very famous place. And so I was living there, and it was a beautiful experience. Monastic life means simple living, high thinking. And we often juxtapose that today, and we say people are simply living, hardly thinking. So it was a beautiful experience. And one of the things I often tell people is that it taught me how to be happy in life with practically nothing. The richest person is not the one who has the most. The richest person is the one who needs the least.
Wow.
And so it really brought me into that kind of life of inner fulfillment, inner connection, inner deep spiritual experience. But it wasn't easy. There were tests along the way.
I mean, that's so profound. And there's so many different avenues that we can take this conversation down. I think there's a few things that certainly people who come to our channel ask about. How do you engage with family who might not be at the same point spiritually as you are? How do you navigate your career using a spiritual perspective, particularly if you have to make a choice between, going down the route of a monk versus being a careerist? I'm guessing that you were blessed with a family that also came from a spiritual background that was supportive of your spiritual goals and activities?
Yeah, I grew up in Wembley. My father's from Gujarat, India, and my mother's from East Africa. And they both came over to London in the 70s. And practically from my birth, I grew up going to temples. I grew up hearing things about the Bhagavad Gita, about books like the Mahabharata, and learned many of the traditions and cultures of spirituality as a kid. So yeah, I grew up with that surrounding me.
And what was their response when you turned to them at age 21 and said, I've just graduated university, but here I am wanting to become a monk?
Yeah, of course, different people interface with religion on different levels. For many people, it's a social identity, a kind of culture or a tradition. For others, they take it on a bit more of a serious level. They see it as a philosophy, a way of life. And there are others who take it on an even deeper level where it's a means to understand ultimate purpose and the real means of happiness. So while my parents, of course, were part of this tradition and spiritual culture, when I decided to take it on that level of seriousness, naturally that was a little, you could say, shocking for them.
And there's so many young men, for example, who want to pursue a spiritual life and who get in contact with organizations like ISKCON and other organizations as well. And their parents start to worry that, is my child being brainwashed?
Yeah.
What's your thinking on how you would coach a young person to be spiritual, but take their family on the journey with them?
Yeah. I think I can also tell you a lot of things of what not to do. I've learned from experience. I think the first thing is we must always be very patient with others. When we're going on a journey of transformation, then naturally those who we've lived with, those who love us, will have some element of suspicion, some element of reservation, because they're scared. You're changing. Will they lose you? Will they be able to relate with you in the same way? And so when I took up that spiritual journey, that's what shocked my parents, whether they'd be able to relate with me in the same way. And so the first thing I would say is that we have to be very patient with those around us and compassionately try to explain to them the journey we're on and the reason we're pursuing this. The second thing I would say is that spiritual life is not actually about becoming a monk. It's not that becoming a monk, joining a monastery, shaving your head and donning the saffron robes is the goal of life. No, that's a journey that some people may go on if they have that deep internal calling. The reality is that for 99.9% of people in the world, that's not the way in which they will practice spirituality in their life.
Yeah.
Whether a monk or whether working and in the world and having a family, both can be as spiritual as each other. There's no restriction. However, sometimes it is beneficial for someone to take some time out and really develop deeper spiritual foundations so that they can go back into the world and then practice with some depth. So many people do take that option of becoming a monk for some time.
And what about, I was about to say, what about women? It's far too generic. But let me make it a little bit specific, because we have spiritualists who are men, who are women. We have people who are students, who are married. So if I, for example, represent a young woman who's recently been married, who is in her heart a very spiritual person, but might not be in an environment with her partner, with her in-laws, who come at it from the same perspective. How does she navigate her inner calling with the circumstances around her?
Yeah, there's the ideals of spirituality, and then there's the realities of the world we're living in and the social relationships and the different dynamics. The first thing we have to understand is bhakti, or love or devotion, in Sanskrit has many characteristics, but one of the characteristics is apratihata, which means it can never be interrupted. Love for the divine and connection with the divine is very much an internal affair. And therefore, no matter what external restraints, external limitations may appear, no one can stop the flow of love which comes from the innermost chambers of your heart. And therefore, we find many of the greatest saints in our tradition often had many difficult situations to navigate. But oftentimes those difficult situations simply serve to ignite the deeper fire of desire for this spiritual connection within them. So I would say for someone who has those limitations, continue cultivating it internally. Nowadays we're blessed with many ways to connect. They may not be able to come to a gathering of spiritualists or to a spiritual place, but they can connect with your videos online. And in that way, there are many ways in which we can continue to nurture. I think there are two approaches to life. Some people see problems in every opportunity, and others see opportunities in every problem. And we have to become progressive, positive, pragmatic spiritualists and try to find what is the unique opportunity for me in this situation by which I can move forward. And there always is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes complete sense. I think the internal state that you describe is so important, because that's something that we can take into every sphere, whether it's our family, our workplace, it's simply even in the gym or on the walk, shopping for groceries, cooking your food. That internal space of connection is so important. How do we transfer that? What's the best way to educate our children on developing such an internal concept of connection?
Every parent, every leader, every person who wants to inspire another person must first become the embodiment of what they seek to teach. Example before precept. Walk your talk. Practice what you preach. And therefore it all begins with our own character, our own inspiration. Children are incredibly observant. Sometimes you don't even have to tell them things. Just by seeing you, they will pick up so many things. I even saw in my childhood so many relatives who were devotionally rich in their life, and just by watching their devotion, it became a great inspiration to me. So the first thing I would say is that we have to, if we want to teach something, we have to be that. We have to embody it.
Yeah.
Chanakya Pandit says something interesting about children. He says, in the beginning, you give them lots of love. And then later on, you have to give them discipline. But then ultimately, you give them friendship and independence. And I find that formula to be very powerful when thinking about how to cultivate the next generation. A lot of love to develop relationship. Then a lot of discipline and knowledge to give grounding. And then ultimately, friendship and independence to let them follow their heart and find their way. Because you can't force anyone. Even at the end of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna doesn't force Arjuna, but he simply says, I've given you the knowledge, now you think about it, and then do what you wish to do.
Maharaj, your answers so far have been both profound and balanced. We've spoken about Shastra, but we've also spoken about the practicalities of being a spiritualist, particularly in terms of how you navigate family relations. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a problem that a lot of young people today are facing. It's something that I've had to deal with. It's something that people are coming across regardless of gender. And that is the proliferation of both sensual as well as sexual content online, on television, and in all of our lives. There's two movements that have started to develop around this. One, which is normalizing a lot of this content and saying that, it's perfectly healthy to be consuming it and, living a life where that's part of the normal. And interestingly, there's now a bit of a counterculture movement speaking on topics like semen retention, brahmacharya, that talks about how we can achieve our goals if we are able to control our impulses. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of tension between the two. So as someone who's been a brahmachari in robes for nearly half of their life, how would you advise people about the true meaning of brahmacharya?
Yes, we live in a world in which there are so many images that we're bombarded by every single day, which naturally then sit within our consciousness and agitate our mind and senses. The Bhagavad Gita begins by explaining to us identity. The Bhagavad Gita says we have a physical identity, which is this body made up of 5 elements. Then the Bhagavad Gita says we have a subtle identity, which is the mind and the emotions that we go through. And then the Bhagavad Gita says beyond all of that is our first identity, our real identity, our original identity, which is to be a spiritual being. And therefore, in the world, when we see a proliferation of images, sexual images, pornographic images, which almost reinforce this identification with the physical, the main problem with that is it blocks us from accessing a deeper level of ourselves, and it blocks us from accessing deeper relationships with people on a more spiritual level. And therefore, for any progressive spiritualist, learning how to navigate the sexual urge and to not deny it on one side, but to not also just let it loose on the other side, but to deal with it in an appropriate way is an incredibly important part of spiritual progression.
Yeah, absolutely. And you use the example of the Bhagavad Gita where Bhagavan gives us this profound message. Are there any practical tips or suggestions to your mind that one can pick out of the verses of the Bhagavad Gita to practice this sort of higher level of brahmacharya and relationships that you describe?
Yeah, so brahmacharya is about some level of restraint, some level of regulation. Now, one very important thing to understand is that when people hear the word restraint or restriction or regulation, they think that it's almost a limitation on them. However, we can also see that restriction, regulation, and this kind of restraint, what it does is it actually opens up a bigger freedom. Tomorrow we could walk out of the door and we'll go driving down the road. When there's a traffic light, we stop.
Yeah.
Now that's a restriction. But that restriction, we understand, is for our protection. Because if you just decided to stop the traffic light to get to your journey fast, you may well hit a car and then you'll be truly grounded.
Yeah.
And therefore, restriction and freedom are not opposed. In fact, when Srila Prabhupada told his disciples and recommended that they regulate their sexual activity, then he called it regulative principles of freedom, which almost seems like counterintuitive.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the first thing we have to understand is that restriction and freedom are not opposed. Rather, some level of restriction can lead to truer freedom. And then just to come back to your second point, which is what practical guidance does the Gita give? I give a very simple acronym. If you want to control the sexual urge, it will cost you.
Right.
C stands for conviction. We have to realize that there's a much higher pleasure, a much bigger goal, a much better thing that we're aiming for. And when we have the conviction that our North Star is much more valuable, we'll be able to give up the temptation of immediate gratification. O stands for openness. We can only achieve real purity on that level when we have relations and good friendships where we can be open and honest, reveal our successes, our failures, our struggles. Therefore, we need good company, openness. S stands for safety. If we want to embrace sexual purity, then we have to ensure that we don't put ourselves and subject ourselves to provoking situations, agitating images and agitating desires. And T stands for taste. The ultimate way in which to overcome the sexual impulse is to experience something much better, something much higher, much more fulfilling on a much deeper level, and that spiritual connection. And so C, protect yourself on the intellectual level. O, protect yourself on the emotional level. S, safety, protect yourself on the physical level. And T, taste, protect yourself by ultimately rising to the spiritual level.
What an incredible practical set of guidelines. COST, are you willing to bear the cost? How badly do you want it?
Yeah.
Now, one of the narratives around brahmacharya, about how living a regulated life is, and I hope you don't mind me saying
Yes.
this, is it gives you superpowers. People talk about unlimited focus and your voice deepens and you become even more muscular than you already are. As someone who's practiced brahmacharya for a number of years, is this true? Do you actually get superpowers?
Of course, it's been medically proven that there are great physical and intellectual subtle benefits of brahmacharya. When we're able to preserve the vital fluids within the body, that nourishes us on a physical level, so we are less subjected to disease, we're less subjected to fatigue, we're less subjected to different ailments of the body that most people in the world struggle with. And then on a more subtle level, through brahmacharya, your cognition improves, your memory improves, you become more able to discriminate, your intelligence becomes much more clear, razor sharp focus. These things have been practically proven and experienced. So yes, those are definitely the physical and subtle benefits of brahmacharya. What to speak of the higher spiritual benefits?
I couldn't have imagined a better person to ask these questions. And I'm genuinely, with all my heart, grateful that you were open to answering them, because I think one of the challenges is that we don't have open spaces in which these topics can be discussed. Real challenges that even spiritualists have around regulating their own desires.
Yeah. And just in response, another question which often comes up is that isn't that repression unnatural? And does that repression sometimes lead to bigger problems in the future because that energy hasn't been released? But again, what we're seeing in the practice of the Bhagavad Gita and how the Vedic teachers recommend brahmacharya is it's not simply a repression or a restriction of the material, but it's then connecting on a spiritual level to connect you to a much higher spiritual emotional experience.
Absolutely.
And so there's no sense of being choked. Freud had this philosophy, that if the sexual energy is not channeled, then it leads to bigger problems. Therefore, we should just express. But in our tradition, we understand that restriction is then augmented by a higher spiritual emotional expression.
And I love how you describe it, attach yourself to something higher and then the lower naturally drops away.
Yes.
Maharaj, these are practical questions that have come out of our community. And I think the most frequent question that comes up is about life and death. Now, this is a subject that's explored extensively in the Bhagavad Gita. The context of the Gita is that Arjun doesn't want to fight. But in the world that we see around us today, death is ever present, probably more than it has been in previous eras. We've got the conflict in Ukraine that's continuing and extracting a huge human toll. We've got civil conflicts in different parts of the world. And here we are as humans connected to all of these different events and, living the reality of death every day. How does one as a seeker navigate being face to face with death?
Of course, the irony is that though we're surrounded by death, sometimes that inconvenient reality, we are able to somehow conveniently shut it out of our minds. Yamaraj, he asked Yudhishthira, what is the most amazing thing in the world? And Yudhishthira said, every single day I see people who are leaving the world for the abode of Yamaraj. I'm surrounded by death. Yet I think I will live here forever. So I think the first thing is even though we're surrounded by death, sometimes we're not registering that on a deep level. Krishna actually interestingly says in the Bhagavad Gita, in Sanskrit, he says, Janma mrityu jara vyadi dukha doshanu darshanam. Darshan is a very interesting word in Sanskrit. It means to view or to see or to behold a vision. And generally when we think of darshan in spiritual, Vedic culture, we think of going and seeing Krishna. But Krishna actually says in the Bhagavad Gita, every single day you should have another type of darshan. You should see that the world is full of disease, old age, and ultimately death. Death in Vedic culture, in spiritual culture, is not something to be fearful of. Death is actually life's greatest change agent, because death makes you remember what's your priority. Death helps you to remember the urgency of action. Death brings humility. In the face of death, we get immunity from all the other fears which dominate our consciousness. So actually, spiritualists are constantly thinking about death because it brings clarity and deeper meaning into their life.
But don't you think that for an aspiring spiritualist, this sort of message can sometimes lead them down a bit of a nihilistic path, saying, well, I'm going to die anyway, so why bother? Might as well just have a bit of fun or not do anything at all.
Yes. Of course, we understand that this life is a chapter in a longer story. Krishna says, yes, for the soul there is neither birth nor death. The soul is simply coming into different situations. So although the spiritualist knows that death comes, the spiritualist also knows that death is not the end. Death is not a full stop. Death is just a comma to the next part of the journey. And so what we do now, how we act now, what we contribute to the world to make it a better place, how we serve others to uplift and elevate them in their lives, that will then reflect in our future situations. And therefore, death doesn't make one irresponsible, or death doesn't make one dysfunctional, but rather death allows one to act in the present in the most appropriate and powerful way, and also prepare for what may lie beyond this life.
Yeah. And once we experience death, I think anyone experiences some degree of grief. And particularly for sensitive hearts, that grief becomes very difficult to deal with. So how do you practically navigate that very real human emotion of grief with some of this knowledge that you've been sharing from the Gita?
Well, let me share this with you. Krishna spoke the whole Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna. And in that Bhagavad Gita, Krishna told Arjuna, the soul never dies. Therefore, don't lament for the dead. 10 days later, after Arjuna had grasped all of that knowledge, on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, his own son, the valiant warrior Abhimanyu, was trapped within the military formation of the Kauravas and mercilessly killed. When Arjuna heard that knowledge, Krishna rushed over and took Arjuna to that point in the battlefield. Arjuna saw his son Abhimanyu slain on the ground, and Arjuna cried. Krishna was right next to him. And the amazing thing is, Krishna never reminded him, the wise never lament for the lip. No, Krishna was quiet, and he said, go through your grieving, go through your mourning. This is a human emotion.
Yeah.
However, Arjuna had grasped that knowledge, and after he had gone through his grieving, he picked up his Gandiva bow and he continued on in his life. It's a very deep lesson. It means that when you become a spiritualist, when you come to terms with death and what it is, it doesn't mean that you won't grieve when someone leaves this world. Life will never be the same.
Yeah.
However, the spiritualist knows life can still be beautiful. And therefore, with that knowledge, the spiritualist is able to pick themselves up and continue in an enthusiastic, hungry way for life.
One of the beautiful aspects of being on a spiritual journey is that we have so many role models who teach us how to live. But recently I had a role model, as did many people around the world, who taught us how to pass from this world, who was your Guru Maharaj, Kadambakanana Swamiji. He, when faced with terminal cancer, chose to move on with service up until his very last moment. And you were with him, particularly at the end of that journey. What was your experience? of being with Maharaj, when he was faced with death, how did he come across?
They say there's two situations in life when you can understand what's really inside someone. One, when they're alone, and two, when they're put into suffering. In those times, what's really within us comes out. And therefore, at the time when he found out that he only had a certain amount of time in this world, the main question that was on his mind was, in whatever time I have, how can I do the most amount of service and then leave this world in a graceful way in spiritual consciousness? There was no fear, there was no regret, there was no sense of frustration. The spiritualist learns to love life and embrace death. And therefore, it was very beautiful to see this in action. Many people can speak philosophy, many people can give very eloquent speeches and presentations, but can we live it? And therefore, it was very inspiring to see when he found out he had cancer, then he decided that the time had come and the call had come. So he decided not to take any medical treatment because it wouldn't provide any ultimate long-term solution. And he went to Vrindavan. They say people go to Vrindavan for one of two reasons. Either you go there for inspiration, or you go there to prepare for the next world. And that's what he did. So he went to Vrindavan, and there he spent his final days remembering the divine, absorbing and immersing himself in meditation and study and association with other spiritualists. And in that way, he left very gracefully, very peacefully in perfect spiritual consciousness.
And what was your experience watching him go through that journey?
Mixed emotions. We realized that relationship is never going to be the same. We're not going to have that connection, that presence in that way. And that's obviously painful. They say the greatest pain in the world is separation from your spiritually dear ones. But there was another great sense of appreciation for everything we had received in that relationship. And another side of me was excitement, because it said that spiritual relationships never end. And sometimes in the separation after someone leaves the world, the relationship actually becomes intensified and closer.
Yeah.
And therefore in Sanskrit, separation is known as viraha, which means the separation between two. But viraha has a double meaning, vishesha rahasya unmilam, which means a very, very special, confidential type of meeting.
Yes.
And therefore I knew that in that journey where he was going to the next world, there would be separation, but also the opportunity of a special kind of meeting.
Life and death, grief and moving on. These are deep subjects that we don't really encounter on YouTube. And I'm flooded with gratitude that you have not only given us such profound answers from the scriptures, but also from your own lived experience. I think, I joined everyone who's watching in expressing our profound gratitude. Yeah. Why do you think it was important to serve these young people specifically?
The Bhagavad Gita goes on a journey. There's different ways to look at it. But one way to look at it is the very first thing that Krishna does in the Bhagavad Gita is he helps Arjuna to redefine success. In our life, we create many goals, many ambitions, many plans for the future. When we're 21, 22, 23, we make all these decisions that eventually we have to live with for the rest of our life. And therefore, what we try to do with the young people is help them through the Bhagavad Gita to define what is a successful life. What will actually bring you happiness? What is the great thing that you're ultimately trying to achieve? So that when they do make their decisions, where they want to live, what career they want to do, who they want to marry, what kind of lifestyle they want to adopt, they have the North Star of where they're aiming. Because if you get that North Star, later on in life, it may be too late. And therefore, we try to share it with the young people, and they're very much appreciating that.
Now, one of the advantages of having you here, captive as it were, is I get to ask you questions that, are debates that I end up being drawn into. One such debate is about the Mahabharata war specifically, as well as the overall epic being quite fantastical in some ways. There's elements of it, for example, missiles, instant travel, materialization, that doesn't quite resonate with society and life as we see it today. And one of the challenges that I've encountered when talking about the Bhagavad Gita is people end up thinking, well, if the Mahabharata didn't happen, then the Bhagavad Gita didn't happen, and therefore it's not really relevant to our lives. Is there a way to decouple the wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita from the broader storyline of the Mahabharata?
Excellent question. Yeah, people often feel some of these scriptures to almost be mythological.
Yeah.
But this is what I tell people. Imagine 100 years ago, you told someone that they could pick up a plastic device, push a few buttons, and connect with someone across the world within a second. They would be thinking you're talking about some fantastical sci-fi movie, that will never really happen. But now we do that without a second thought.
Yeah.
That shows how in such a small amount of time, how much perceptions can shift.
Yes.
And therefore, when we're dealing with the Mahabharata, we're dealing with a different time, a different civilization, a different spiritual acumen that we may not observe around us in the world today, but which we can't discount existed at some time.
Yes.
And therefore, if we always try to measure reality based on what we've perceived, then our notion of reality will always be very limited. And so the Mahabharata is not a mythology. It's a factual, historical event which happened. And there's been so much scientific evidence and historical evidence which corroborates the events and the history of the Mahabharata that have also come to light over the years. And in that way, we understood it's a real event and it's a real conversation.
Yes.
The Bhagavad Gita, as I've mentioned before, is also a real conversation. It was spoken to Arjuna in his moment of crisis. But as I've mentioned before, the Arjuna sits within each one of us. Even Will Smith, he said at one point, I'm reading the Bhagavad Gita, I'm 90% through, and I'm finding my inner Arjuna. So it's a conversation which relates to us here and now in 2023, in this world with all our pressures. And in that way, the Bhagavad Gita is timeless. It's factual, it's beautiful, and it's timeless.
I'm slightly overcome. I can't believe that this is the last one of our currently scheduled conversations. But it's been such a joy. It's been such a blessing more than a joy to speak to you about some of these challenges and get a really practical perspective on what it means to be a spiritualist. With that, I thank Maharaj, and I thank all of you for joining us on A Seeker's Journey.